We are reducing the role and number of weapons in our arsenal while maintaining a safe, secure, and effective deterrent to protect our nation, allies, and partners.
Well, there's Secretary Clinton, along with any number of other officials who were announcing a fundamental change in U.S. nuclear policy today. Let's bring in our panel: Steve Hayes, senior writer for the Weekly Standard; Mort Kondracki, executive editor of Roll Call; and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Now, the interesting thing about this was that, well, there are all sorts of interesting things about it. I mean, one wire story summarized the new policy as, under the new plan, the U.S. promises not to use nuclear weapons against countries that don't have them. I didn't know that was our policy to begin with, but nevertheless, for decades, the U.S. has kept open the possibility of using nuclear weapons under various circumstances against the old Soviet Union in particular, if it were necessary. Now President Obama says he is changing that by narrowing the circumstances and the number of countries who might be threatened. Charles, what does this mean in practice, and why now?
Well, let me tell you the one scenario they brought up explicitly, and that is if the United States is attacked by a country with biologic or chemical weapons. Under the old policy of every administration for decades, our response is we're going to obliterate that country with a nuclear response. That's been the Clinton policy, the Reagan policy, everybody. And now we have a new policy that if that occurs, before we would retaliate in that way, the White House lawyers would ascertain if that country is in compliance with the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And if it is, if it's kept up with its IAEA inspections, it gets immunity from a massive nuclear retaliation. It gets instead, I suppose, a retaliation with TNT and Marines shooting guns. Now, this to me is either insane or ridiculous. I can't decide. I report, you decide. It's ridiculous even in the moral sense. Our assumption of this scenario is that the greatest war crime in history is committed, let's say, in Boston, and we're going to look to see if the country is in compliance with IAEA regulations in determining if it's immunized from a nuclear retaliation or not. Secondly, and probably more importantly, is the idea that we are not going to use nukes in defending an ally or in deterring an attack on an ally with conventional weapons. We kept the peace in Europe for 50 years, where the Soviets had a huge advantage in tanks and could have occupied Western Europe overnight, because from Kennedy on we had a policy of extended deterrence. You attack with tanks, we retaliate, and Moscow disappears. Is it a credible threat? Who knows? But the Russians had to worry about it. It was our policy from Kennedy on up until Obama, and now it disappears. If you're an ally, what are you going to think about America as your defender and America as a deterror of an attack on you?
No, now, we have not ruled out first use. The ultra-liberals wanted him to rule out first use. That's the second case that you're talking about. If there's a massive attack in Europe, we still have a nuclear umbrella over it, and that's specifically why he did not renounce first use. Look, this is, the amount of change here from the Bush policy is rather minor. I mean, the fact is that if what we said is that if we get attacked with chemical and biological weapons by Iran or North Korea, that we're still going to respond. We still can respond with nukes, and the lawyers, believe me, will far precede the attack. I mean, there will be a list, and Iran and North Korea are on notice. Furthermore, Obama said that he wants to get rid of all nuclear weapons. Now, this is moving in that direction very, very, very slowly. We're going to have 1,500 nuclear warheads under the START treaty. As I said, we're not renouncing first use, etc. And it's amazing. Not only did Ronald Reagan want to get rid of nuclear weapons, George Shultz wants to get rid of nuclear weapons. Henry Kissinger wants. Obama is much more realistic than they are.
Well, here's what I can't figure out, Steve. There were 150 meetings about this, and the president is said to have intervened in many of them. What has he ruled out? It's hard for me to figure out exactly what is different about this policy and our previous. And one of the things that was said today was that we would only use nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances. Well, I would hope so.
Right. Well, I think interestingly, I agree with part of what Mort said and part of what Charles said. I think in a sense, the policy is even more incoherent than Charles suggested is, because right after, if you look at his first example, right after they in effect rule out this counterattack after a chem bio attack, they say a couple pages later, we could revise our opinion. We could reconsider this attack if we decide to. Well,
if it were a
of course
serious
you
one,
can.
yeah,
Of course you can. Look, I think the bigger problem is this is sort of classic Obama. It's big on language. It's big on rhetoric. The changes are not earth-shattering, but what it does is it sets up the United States as the good example once again, and he seems to think that this is an effective way of conducting nuclear policy. I think the lessons of the past 30 years would suggest otherwise. We've reduced our warheads from 10,000 to somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000. We aren't producing fissile material. We haven't designed a new warhead. I mean, there are all sorts of things that we've done to set a good example over the past several decades, and yet the world is becoming more and more nuclear and more dangerous.
All right, quick.
There's one other thing.
Quickly.
I mean, look, the real danger here is Iran and North Korea. And Hillary Clinton, as I understand it, just got through advising the leadership of Congress not to go ahead with a conference committee report on this bill calling for gasoline embargoes. Now, that is counterproductive.
Why not?
Well, because we ought to be threatening a gasoline embargo to get the Iranians.
Why does she call for him not to do it?
Well, because they don't want to hurt the Iranian population. I mean, you're not going to have sanctions that bite or cripple without affecting the population.
I've got to correct you on the use of nukes, declared use of nukes, as we have had for 50 years, in protecting an ally or deterring an attack on an ally with conventional weapons. Under this nuke policy doesn't exist. No first use or not. What it does
Gotta go, Charles.
It takes away the nuclear umbrella, and that's new.